Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision, almost like engineering, you
Oh,
know?
absolutely. Yeah.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is, that's the fracture.
Yeah.
It's broken or not broken, like a very clean binary.
Right. And I mean, it is incredibly comforting. As humans, we desperately want things to be visible, to be categorized, to just have clear borders.
Yeah, exactly. But then you step into the world of ancient Madhyamaka philosophy, and suddenly that x-ray machine just shatters. The whole light board goes dark.
It really does.
So welcome back to the deep dive. Since you've already journeyed with us through the deconstruction of causality, motion, and perception in the earlier chapters, you already understand the mechanics of the triads and the two truths. You know how this logical engine works.
You're primed and ready.
Right. And today, we are taking that exact same ruthless logical architecture, and we are turning it directly onto the timeline of your life. We are diving relentlessly into Chapter 11 of Nāgārjuna's Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, which is his analysis of the past and future limits of existence, or saṃsāra.
Yeah, and to really grasp what is at stake here, we have to look at who Nāgārjuna was arguing with. Right, we have to look at the Abhidharma schools.
Right, because he's not just swinging at the air.
No, not at all. What's fascinating here is that Nāgārjuna isn't just arguing against a vague feeling. He is systematically dismantling some of the most sophisticated, highly categorized philosophical systems ever constructed. Specifically, schools of thought like the Sarvastivada and the Sautrantika.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Let's pause and unpack those two, because we toss those names around, but their specific motivations are really fascinating. They weren't just cataloging reality for the fun of it, were they?
No. They were trying to defeat chaos, essentially.
Right.
I mean, think about the historical context. The Buddha had presented a universe of radical impermanence. Everything is changing. Everything is suffering. There is no permanent self. And for a lot of scholars, that level of fluidity is just absolutely terrifying.
Oh, it's existential vertigo.
Exactly. So the Abhidharma schools, over centuries, they tried to map that impermanence. They wanted to find the irreducible building blocks of reality.
Like the fundamental pixels of the universe.
Yes, perfect analogy. The Sarvastivada school, for instance, their name literally translates to the doctrine that all exists. They argued that while things change, the fundamental elements, the dharmas, they exist in the past, the present, and the future.
So a past event still possessed a sort of shadowy ontological reality?
Right, which is how they explain karma carrying forward. And then the Sautrantika school pushed back and said, no, only the present moment is real. But both of them, and this is the really crucial part, both of them believed that saṃsāra was a strictly linear sequence.
Like a strip of film.
Exactly. They treated birth, aging, and death as discrete, inherently existent events moving on a rigid timeline. They possess what they called svabhava, an inherent nature.
So the Abhidharma worldview is one where you can point to the timeline of saṃsāra and say, here is a solid beginning, here is a definable middle, and here is a definitive end.
Yes. And Nāgārjuna is about to just completely dismantle this linear timeline.
Which brings us to step 1 of our Madhyamaka reasoning, identifying the specific triad. In previous deep dives, we were looking at things like the actor, the action, and the object. But here, we're targeting the very grammatical structure of time itself.
We are isolating 3 temporal spheres. First, the beginning, or purva, which encompasses the past, origination, and birth.
Okay.
Then we have the middle, which is the present, duration, the act of living. And finally, the ending, APARAKITI, which is the future, cessation, or death.
Right. And before we apply the logic to those 3, I want to just note how deeply ingrained this triad is in our psychology.
Oh, completely.
Like, I think about it how the conceptual mind instinctively visualizes a tape measure.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Like, we want the tape to have a hard metal tip. That's the beginning. We want a measurable span with little ticks on it, the middle, and a definitive housing where it rolls up the end. We apply this biological expectation to saṃsāra itself.
We demand that narrative structure. But once we identify these 3 spheres, the logical engine must be applied to see if those boundaries can hold up to absolute scrutiny, which immediately leads us into step 2.
Using the tetralemma to demonstrate logical absurdity.
Yes. Nāgārjuna systematically walks through the application of the tetralemma to the sequencing of time. This is around verses 3 to 5 of chapter 11.
Walk us through it. He tests the prior sequence first, right?
Right. Let's assume the conventional narrative is the ultimate reality, meaning that birth inherently precedes aging and death.
Which seems completely obvious. First you're born, then you get old, then you die.
It seems unassailable until you demand ultimate independent reality from it. Remember, Nāgārjuna is asking if these stages have svabhava. Do they exist entirely on their own? Because if birth inherently preceded aging and death, it would have to exist completely independently of them.
Okay, so it holds its own reality from its own side. Why is that a logical problem?
Because if birth is completely isolated from death, you are forced to accept a birth that is completely free from the possibility of death.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You are positing that a fundamentally deathless, immortal entity is being born into the world. If the sphere of birth is truly independent, it has no connective tissue to the sphere of death.
Wait, okay, I have to push back here, and I'm sure anyone listening has the same objection. In our conventional, peer-reviewed understanding of biology, a seed is born before it dies.
Right, the classic botanical descent.
Yeah, I plant an acorn, it sprouts, that's birth. Decades later, it's an oak tree. Centuries later, it rots. How does Nāgārjuna circumvent our biological reality here? Because you can't just logic away a rotting tree.
And he's absolutely not trying to. That pushback is essential. But it completely misunderstands what Nāgārjuna is targeting. He is not denying that you can observe an acorn growing. He's attacking inherent independent existence. Svabhava.
Okay, so what's the difference between my garden acorn and the ultimate acorn?
If the acorn's birth was an absolute isolated event, if it had svabhava, it would be frozen in its state of being born. An inherently existent thing cannot change. If it changed, it wouldn't be inherent. It would be dependent on new conditions.
Oh, I see.
So if the seed's birth was an absolute reality, it would be incapable of ever interacting with time to eventually reach the state of becoming an oak tree, let alone dying.
So a purely prior sequence fails because it essentially freezes the universe at the moment of origin.
Exactly.
Okay, so what if we flip it? What if aging and death preceded birth, the posterior sequence?
Well, if you posit the posterior sequence, you face a causally incoherent universe. You'd have the uncaused dying of a completely unborn entity.
Right, you can't end a song that hasn't started playing.
Exactly. It violates the most basic principles of causality that the Abhidharma schools themselves rely upon.
Okay, so linear is out. What about simultaneous? What if birth, duration, and death happen at the exact same mathematical instant?
If they happen at the exact same time, the entity would be actively dying at the exact microsecond of its birth. They'd cancel each other out. It renders both processes completely uncaused and functionally paralyzed. There's no life to experience.
So every single temporal sequence, prior, posterior, simultaneous, leads to a logical brick wall.
Total catastrophic failure.
Which means we're forced to strip these concepts of their inherent reality, arriving seamlessly at step 3. We have to conclude that the three spheres are empty of inherent existence.
Exactly. A true, fixed, or absolute beginning, middle, or end to samsara, or any entity at all, is fundamentally impossible. They're entirely empty of svabhava.
And Nāgārjuna points back to the textual evidence for this, right?
He does. He references verse 1, where the great Muni, the Buddha, states that the earliest limit of samsara is simply not known.
But the Abhidharma schools read that quote very differently, didn't they?
Oh, radically differently. They read, the beginning is unknown, and thought, well, samsara is just unimaginably long. The beginning is out there somewhere. Our telescopes just aren't strong enough to see it.
Like it's an archiving problem.
Right. But Nāgārjuna takes this further. It's not just that it's too far back to see. It's that the limit itself is empty of svabhava. The ontological category of an absolute beginning doesn't exist.
Which is terrifying for the human mind, because emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. If these temporal boundaries don't exist independently, how do they exist? Like, my calendar still works.
Which necessitates step 4, concluding that the three spheres are dependently co-arisen.
Right. From this profound emptiness, we have to recognize the co-evolution of time. The phases are inseparable.
They are. The past, present, and future are dependently co-arisen, co-defined, and co-evolving. They don't exist as separate buckets. They are merely co-imputed by the mind in dependence upon karmic conditioning.
So a beginning only makes sense if there is an ending to contrast it with.
It's exactly.
They are grammatical twins, like left and right. You can't find an inherent left floating out in space.
Right. Left only exists because your mind simultaneously holds the concept of right. An origination requires a cessation to even be understood as an origination.
Which brings us to the delicate balance between the absolute lack of boundaries and the functional appearance of time, which is the bedrock of Madhyamaka thought. Step 5.
Note the union of the two truths.
Yes.
We have to reiterate for the listener that the conventional appearance of temporal sequence, the dependent origination, and its ultimate lack of absolute boundaries, the emptiness, exist in a seamless union.
One truth enables the other.
They are mutually necessary. It is only because the temporal limits of samsara are empty and fluid that the cycle of birth and death can conventionally function at all.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if time were fixed, like Abhidharma's discrete moments, change would be physically impossible. Cell division couldn't happen.
The universe would be a frozen photograph.
Right, so the conventional world breathes and moves because it is empty.
Exactly. And understanding this union forces us to change how we perceive our daily reality, which leads us to the experiential realization in step 6. We conclude that the three spheres are illusory.
The karmic mirage.
Yes, because the boundaries of time and existence are dependently co-arisen and empty, they must be viewed as illusions, reflections, or dreams.
I really like the mirage analogy, because a mirage is functionally there when you're in the desert.
Right, it bends the light, it makes you feel hopeful or desperate.
It has real biological effects, but ultimately it's not there as an absolute reality composed of water molecules. The linear sequence from past to future is functionally there for our calendars and our biology, but ultimately not there as an absolute reality. It's a karmic mirage.
But we have to be incredibly careful here.
Why?
Because to ensure we don't accidentally turn this mirage into a new rigid dogma, we must apply a second layer of philosophical negation. We move to step 7.
Use the generalized tetralemma.
Yes. We have to transcend conceptual frameworks entirely. We apply the generalized tetralemma to ensure we do not fall into new conceptual traps. These existential boundaries are not this, they are not non-this, not both, and not neither.
Let me clarify that for a second. We cannot categorize reality as strictly permanent, like a continuous, eternal thing, nor can we categorize it as impermanent, meaning completely discontinuous or annihilated.
Right. Let's think about going through a rough romantic breakup.
Okay.
Your mind wants to grasp at extremes. You might think, this pain is absolute, it is permanent, I will feel like this forever. That's eternalism.
Reifying the present moment.
Yes, and the tetralemma negates that. It's not this, but then you might swing to the opposite extreme. You look at the past 5 years and think, well, it ended, so it meant nothing. It's completely annihilated.
Impermanence taken to a nihilistic extreme.
Exactly. And the tetralemma says, no, it's not strictly impermanent either. The karmic ripples of that relationship continue to echo forward. Reality completely transcends these conditioned, dualistic conceptual proliferations.
So exhausting the mind's reliance on these rigid dualistic boxes naturally leaves us in a state of conceptual freefall.
It does, which is precisely where step 8 catches us. Adopt the middle way.
The limitless fractal cycle.
As we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we see Nāgārjuna's true vision. We adopt a middle way completely free from all extremes.
And what does that look like? The realization that existence is a nonlinear, limitless, and centerless fractal cycle. There is no absolute timeline to grasp.
None at all.
Every apparent beginning is simultaneously an ending, entirely depending on the perspective of the observer. Like the rotting acorn we talked about earlier, that ending is the exact same event as the soil being enriched for new life. It's an origination.
It's a continuous holographic flux, like a Mandelbrot set. Wherever you zoom in, every edge of a pattern is just the beginning of a new pattern.
But practically speaking, as scholars, as humans, we still have to wake up and navigate the world. I still have to pay my mortgage. How do we live in a fractal cycle? This leads us to step 9, right?
It does. Act conventionally, without acting in absolute terms.
Because I can't just stare at a spreadsheet and marvel at the fractal cycle while I get fired.
No, this is the practice of navigation. It's the mastery of acting without acting. We use the concepts of time, birth, and death conventionally to navigate the world. We schedule meetings, we study texts, we mourn passings.
We engage non-dualistically.
Yes, but we never reify them in absolute terms.
Right, so we engage with the karmic cycle without attachment, without an absolute death grip on reality. We don't reject the world as a pure illusion, but we don't cling to it as absolute truth either.
Exactly. And when we successfully navigate the world without this heavy, absolute grasping, our perception of the universe fundamentally shifts, arriving at step 10.
Perceive everything as primordially equal.
Dropping the tyranny of time. Released from the tyrannical illusion of fixed temporal limits, a profound psychological and spiritual shift occurs.
A universal purity.
Yes. we begin to perceive every stage of the cycle, whether it is conventionally labeled birth or aging or death, as primordially equal, pure, perfect, and divine.
Because if no point on the timeline has inherent reality, no single point is inherently better or more real than another.
Right. We stop frantically fleeing aging because we stop seeing youth as an inherently superior solid state.
Which is such a relief. And this total equality ultimately collapses the final, most deeply held dualistic boundary in Buddhist philosophy, bringing us to our culmination in step 11.
Recognize the one, or non-dual suchness.
So what does this all mean? It means that because there is no real, absolute beginning or ending to anything, the conceptual boundary between saṃsāra, the cycle of suffering, and nirvana liberation completely dissolve.
It completely breaks down. To abide in this realization is to rest in reality exactly as it is. Tathata Sachin.
Because saṃsāra has no absolute boundaries, it can't be a real prison that traps you, and so nirvana can't be a separate, solid destination outside of it.
The limitless cycle itself, when perceived with wisdom, is primordially pure. It is nirvana.
That is just explosive.
Yeah.
Having completed the 11 steps, let's zoom out to apply this framework to a massive doctrinal concept that spans all of Buddhist thought, the 12 links and the karmic cycle.
Right. Reframing the 12 links of dependent origination. This raises an important question regarding how we view those links.
Yeah.
Ignorance, formations, consciousness, all the way down to aging and death.
They are traditionally taught as a chronological chain spanning lifetimes. A causes B, which causes C.
Yes, but Chapter 11 shatters this. If there are no absolute temporal limits, there is no first moment of ignorance and no final cessation of aging and death.
So karma is completely nonlinear.
Entirely. Ignorance and birth are mutually conditioning. They co-arise in a centerless loop.
If the karmic cycle is not a rigid linear chain, our actions, conditions, and results co-arise interdependently. We aren't just pushing dominoes in a straight line.
What's a better way to think of it?
I'd say we are dropping stones into a pond where all the ripples affect all the other ripples simultaneously.
I love that.
Yeah.
When we act, we alter the entire karmic landscape of the present moment, which reframes the past and conditions the future all at once.
So just to briefly recap the immense journey we've taken today, by deconstructing the temporal limits of saṃsāra through our 11-step Madhyamaka reasoning, we dismantled the Abhidharma's linear timeline.
We did.
We revealed a centerless, limitless karmic fractal where every ending is a beginning, and where saṃsāra and nirvana are completely non-dual.
And I want to leave the listener with a final contemplation based on this.
Please do.
Consider your own memories of the past and your anxieties about the future. If time is a dependently co-arisen mirage, and there is no absolute timeline holding your identity hostage, how much of your current stress is just the friction of trying to freeze a fluid, centerless cycle?
Wow. Yeah.
Tomorrow, try to view your next ending, whether it's the end of a workday or the end of a project, not as a terminus, but as the exact origin point of a new cycle. Entirely empty and bursting with potential.
Thank you, peer listener, for joining this intense deep dive into the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā. Keep questioning the boundaries of your reality, and we'll see you in the flux next time.